Harvard versus Trump. Federal judge questions $2.6 billion funding cuts and antisemitism links. What happens when a world-renowned university clashes with a federal administration over funding and accusations of antisemitism? Buckle up, this legal showdown between Harvard University and the Trump administration is heating up, and the stakes couldn't be higher. On Monday, a federal courtroom became the battleground for a high-stakes argument that's left many scratching their heads. At the center, a controversial decision to slash Harvard's federal funding, allegedly tied to claims of antisemitism within the institution. But here's where it gets controversial. Is this about financial accountability, or is there a deeper narrative at play? Let's break it down. Judge Allison Burroughs, presiding over the case, didn't hand down a verdict during Monday's hearing but promised to deliver her opinion as soon as possible. Harvard, meanwhile, is pushing for a decision before September, a critical deadline tied to grant paperwork. Why? Because if the court doesn't act in time, the funding cuts could become permanent, upending years of financial support for research, education, and community programs. Imagine the ripple effects: labs left without resources, students facing tuition hikes, or groundbreaking studies on public health or climate science grinding to a halt. That's the domino effect Harvard is trying to prevent. Now, let's pause for a moment. The Trump administration's argument hinges on allegations of antisemitism within Harvard's campus culture. But how do you measure antisemitism in a funding decision? Critics argue this could set a dangerous precedent, where political agendas influence academic budgets. Supporters, on the other hand, might say universities must be held accountable for fostering inclusive environments. And this is the part most people miss: the case isn't just about Harvard. It's a test of how the U.S. government balances free speech, institutional autonomy, and civil rights in higher education. But what if the real issue isn't the funding itself? What if it's about who gets to define antisemitism in the first place? The debate has sparked fierce opinions online. Some argue the administration is weaponizing the term to target liberal institutions, while others insist Harvard has a responsibility to address every claim seriously. Where do you stand? Should universities be held to stricter standards when it comes to hate speech? Or does this risk chilling open discourse? Before you scroll away, consider this. Harvard's legal team is fighting not just for its own survival, but for a broader principle, that federal funding decisions shouldn't be driven by political pressure. But if the judge sides with the administration, what does that mean for other universities? Could similar cuts follow? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is this a fair use of executive power, or a slippery slope toward politicizing academia? The clock is ticking, and the answer might shape the future of higher education in America. Court clash: Harvard versus Trump over $2 billion federal funding freeze. ****, a high-stakes legal showdown. Harvard versus Trump administration ****. In a dramatic courtroom clash in Boston, attorneys representing Harvard University and those from the Trump administration engaged in a heated debate over a contentious decision made by President Donald Trump to withdraw billions in federal funding from Harvard's educational programs. During a hearing held on Monday, Judge Allison Burroughs, who presides over the case, expressed skepticism regarding the rationale behind freezing over $2 billion, £1.5 billion, in federal grants aimed at combating antisemitism. She challenged the logic of how cutting funds designated for medical research could effectively address antisemitism, labeling the government's arguments as mind-boggling. The Trump legal team contended that these funding cuts were justified and necessary to penalize what they described as anti-Jewish bias. This case has garnered significant attention, especially as the White House is also attempting to restrict Harvard's access to a visa program that facilitates the enrollment of international students. Judge Burroughs, appointed by former President Barack Obama, has previously issued several interim rulings favoring Harvard in a separate lawsuit concerning the foreign student visa system. In this funding dispute, Harvard has urged the judge to deliver a ruling by September 3, which is the deadline set by the Trump administration for the university to settle its financial commitments related to federal grants. Any decision made in this case is expected to be contested and could potentially escalate to the U.S. Supreme Court. During the crowded courtroom proceedings, Harvard's attorney, Stephen Lahotsky, argued that the administration was attempting to interfere with the university's internal operations. He emphasized that the administration had failed to consider the implications for patients and the general public, as well as the detrimental effects of halting vital research that has been a collaborative effort with the U.S. government for over 80 years. Lahotsky further asserted that there was no evidence to suggest that the funding cuts, which impact research across various fields, including medicine, space exploration, and artificial intelligence, would have any effect on antisemitism within the university. On the other hand, government attorney Michael Velchik claimed that Harvard had breached an executive order signed by Trump aimed at fighting antisemitism. He stated, "Harvard wants billions of dollars, and that is the only reason we are here," revealing his own connection to the university as a 2012 graduate. Velchik defended the administration's decision to cancel the grants, arguing that Harvard had prioritized campus protests over critical cancer research, referencing the anti-Israel demonstrations that have occurred at the university and other campuses nationwide. Judge Burroughs probed the government's criteria for determining whether Harvard officials had adequately addressed antisemitism, noting the lack of documentation or procedures to substantiate their claims. She raised concerns about the government's ability to revoke allocated funds without presenting concrete evidence of antisemitism, stating, "The consequences of that in terms of constitutional law are staggering," and reiterated her disbelief at the government's assertions. "Isn't it necessary to demonstrate that each researcher is anti-Semitic, rather than making a sweeping claim that Harvard itself is anti-Semitic?" she questioned. After nearly 3 hours of arguments, the judge opted not to issue an immediate summary judgment, but promised to provide a ruling in the near future. In a post on Truth Social, Trump criticized the judge, labeling her as biased and a total disaster, predicting that she would rule against the government and vowing to immediately appeal and win. Outside the courthouse, dozens of protesters gathered, holding signs that read "Defend Academic Freedom" and "Hands Off Harvard." Trump has previously indicated that his actions against Harvard might be part of a broader negotiation strategy, suggesting, "I think we are probably going to settle with Harvard." A spokesperson for the White House expressed confidence that Harvard would eventually align with the president's vision, stating that through constructive dialogue and negotiations, a favorable agreement was achievable. This administration's campaign against Harvard is part of a larger initiative to exert pressure on prestigious Ivy League institutions. Earlier this month, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement issued subpoenas to Harvard, demanding information regarding international students, while Trump has previously floated the idea of revoking Harvard's tax-exempt status. In March, Columbia University in New York acquiesced to several demands from the administration, including prohibiting face coverings at protests and reassessing admissions policies, after the White House threatened to withdraw $400 million in funding. However, these concessions did not seem to fully satisfy the administration, leading the U.S. Department of Education to threaten Columbia with the loss of its accreditation.